Next question is, how should we interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament? And so here we've got the Old Testament, we've got the New Testament, and it's kind of like, okay, well, since we've got the New Testament, we as Christians, we live and breathe out of the New Testament. How are we going to interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament? Well, first of all, let's just simply talk about the Old Testament really quickly. As a matter of fact, I think that we're going to kind of start to get a little bit of a deeper dive into things here tonight. I'll try to make it brief. Let's take a look at what the Old Testament is. You know, we look at the Old Testament, we break it down into different categories, right? You know, have you ever heard of this? We got the book of the law, we've got the book of what? History. We've got the books of what? Poetry. We've got the books of the major prophets. We got the books of the minor prophets, okay? And so we categorize and we put all the books in the Old Testament in those categories of kind of those subject materials. But the Old Testament Jews did not do that. They put them in an entirely different category. They had three categories. They had the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And so when you read through the Gospels and you're reading through the words of Jesus Christ, you will notice that he talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. There are sometimes that he's going to just simply say the law and the prophets. There are sometimes that, well, he's just going to say the law. Okay? And so you think, okay, well, what is he referring to? What he's referring to is the Old Testament scriptures. Okay? And so you had the law, which is just simply the first five books of the Bible. And then you had the writings of the prophets, which is interesting because what you might think is a prophetic book does not fall in the books of the prophet. And what you might think is not a prophetic book does fall in the books of the prophets. And then you have the Psalms. And I say that because it's always been very perplexing to me, is because I think that probably one of the most prophetic books in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel. Would you not agree? The book of Daniel is not in the Old Testament category of the prophets. It's in the Old Testament category of the Psalms. And it's how that they viewed things, and it's how that they viewed things in relationship to their synagogue worship and in their readings. Okay? But when you think about the law, the prophets, the Psalms, it kind of goes along something along the lines of this. And that is, the law is going to be God's terms and conditions for his covenant that he made with the nation of Israel. Okay? The prophets are going to be those people that came along and started to chastise the Israelites for not following along with the terms of the law. Okay? And then you've got the Psalms, and the Psalms are more of our reflections about how our relationship is with the Lord in regards to the law and the prophets. Okay? And so there is, going back to that idea about a layering, there is somewhat of a layering effect. But we also always need to remember that it's always based on the law. And so when Jesus said the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, all Old Testament, the law and the prophets, still all Old Testament, but a narrower view. And then he talks about the law, it's still the whole Old Testament, but it is still the most narrowest view, because that is what everything else is based on. It's just simply the law. Now, when we talk about the Old Testament, we talk about the law, and this is where we're kind of getting back to the subject, and that is, how are we going to interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament? We've got to understand what Jesus did with the law. Okay? So, let's take a look at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and in verse number 17. Okay? All right, Matthew chapter 5, and in verse number 17. Jesus said this, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." So there we go. Okay? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the Old Testament scriptures. and the Old Testament scriptures are those things that are primarily based upon the law. So he says, don't think that I've come to abolish that. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So then he goes on to say, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappears, not one smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Okay? So, what are we talking about here? Well, if we just kind of look at a little bit of a timeline here, and we think about the law and the things in the law, because if you remember, the law is just simply those rules, those regulations, those terms of God that He established with the Israelites when He established the covenant. So what Jesus is saying is the law in its entirety to where not the least little stroke of a pen, not the least little dot is going to disappear from the law, okay? Now he says that this isn't going to happen until heaven and earth pass away. Guess it makes more sense to say heaven's on top. Okay, so heaven and earth passing away. When is that going to take place? The end of the age, right? And so the law is going to be in effect, the law is going to be in effect until that point, okay? But he said, I didn't come to abolish it, I came to fulfill it. And so we need to take a look at verse number 18 again. And so he says that in the middle of it, that not the smallest letter, nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Now that word accomplished is the same word as the word fulfilled that he said before that. And so he says, don't think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And so there is a first of this until, which is where Jesus fulfills. Okay? Now, until. What is the word until? What does it mean? It's a stopping, isn't it? You know, you've got something that's in process until. And then what's after the until? It's a difference, isn't it? Okay? You take a little kid and you say, go sit in the corner until your 3-minute timer goes off. Right? So what are they supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be sitting in the corner until that 3-minute timer goes off. When that 3-minute timer goes off, guess what? It's a change of situation for them now, isn't it? You know, before the until, they're in the corner. When the until happens, guess what? They get to get out, you know. Mommy, the timer went off. Can I get up now? Well, yes, you know. It doesn't make any sense to say, go sit in the corner until the timer goes off, and then when the timer goes off, say, no, go back and sit in the corner. Okay? You know, that's just kind of a change of my mind. That's kind of the exasperating your children type of thing, isn't it? You know? Okay? And so it's you know, you're sitting in the corner. Well, it's not an until. It's just, you know, kind of unless I change my mind type of thing. You go sit in the corner for 3 minutes unless I change my mind. That's an entire different scenario than until. The reason why I bring this up is because we're talking about the law. The law is in effect, and the law is in effect very exactly until one of these two things happens, and happens first. Okay? So the real question is, when did Jesus fulfill the law? Well, with his life, and then when he sacrificed his life on Calvary's cross, right? As a matter of fact, in Romans chapter 10, verse number 4, it talks about how Jesus is the end of the law to all those who believe. And when Jesus was on the earth, for example, he talked about how it's not what you put into your body that makes a man unclean, but it is the uncleanliness that comes out of your heart. That's what makes a man unclean. And he said that when you eat things, then it makes, passes through you. And in Mark, it talks about how, and this is one of those little differences between Mark and Mark and Matthew. In Mark, there's a little parenthesis there that says, in doing so, Jesus declared all things clean. And so when we think about this revelation, this layering of revelation that takes place, here Jesus is, he does that, he says that, people hears it, but they really don't quite grasp the meaning and the content of it until after his death, burial, and resurrection, where they realize about Jesus fulfilling the law. And then from that point forward, we start to have God revealing these things. And then when, for example, Peter goes to Cornelius' household, sees the vision of the unclean animals, and then they start to realize how Jesus fulfilled all the purpose of the law. Then the Holy Spirit unveils to Mark about Jesus declaring all foods clean. Do you see what I'm saying? As far as how all of those little details just simply unravel and take place. And so with Jesus fulfilling the law, that kind of makes sense, though, when you think about the purpose of the law. Because the purpose of the law is not to make people righteous, but the purpose of the law is to make people guilty. Okay? When you take a look at Romans chapter 3 and verse number 20, it talks about how by adherence to the law, nobody's going to be made righteous, but rather by the law, people become accountable to sin. And so God's giving of the law, and there's different reasons for it. I mean, it was the Jews' civil law, it was their moral law, but there was a spiritual side to it too. And that's the main thing, that's the main thrust of it. And that is that people were supposed to see, hey, wait a minute, here's God's standards that I can't possibly live up to. And so therefore, since I can't live up to God's standards, I've got to throw myself on God's mercy. Okay? And so that's really what the law was all about. Let's take a look at the book of Galatians chapter 3. Now, I know we're going, a long way away from the original question, but we're going to get there, okay? So Galatians chapter 3. In Galatians chapter 3, looking at verse number 21, even though we're really looking at verse number 23, but at verse 21 it says, is the law therefore opposed to the promises of God? Absolutely not. For if a law had been given that could impart life, then righteousness would certainly have come by the law. And so, here's the idea that the law was there not to make people righteous, but instead to show people's sinfulness. Some people will say, well, you know what, we're just simply talking about the Old Testament works of law. You can be saved by just simply doing these other set of religious laws. Not according to that. When you look at that verse right there, if there was a possibility for someone to be saved by their works, then it would have been by the works of the law, but that's not going to be it. Righteousness would have come by the law, but instead it's got a different purpose of it. And that is, you skip on down to verse 23, it says, before this faith came, we were held prisoners by the law, locked up until, oh wait a minute, there's that word until then, right? Okay? Until faith should be revealed. So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ that we might be justified by faith. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the supervision of the law. And so God put that law there to show us, hey, this is something that you can't do. This is something that is in place to show that you need mercy. And when you start to think about mercy and how God is going to be merciful to us, then all of a sudden we've got the prophets, and the prophets are going to be talking about Jesus and talking about how the Messiah is going to come and talking about all the fullness of what the Messiah is going to bring, right? And so when the Messiah comes and the Messiah fulfills the law, Do we need it anymore? No, we don't. Especially once we come by faith in Jesus Christ. And so once we start to understand the purpose of why that law is there, you can start to see, hey, wait a minute, we don't need the details of the law. And so when you're reading through the Old Testament, you start to read all of these different, interesting regulations and rules, and you start to think, wait a minute, does this mean that I need to, or does this mean I don't need to? Then you got to realize, wait a minute, no, we're not under the law because Jesus fulfilled the law. Now we're getting back to the original question. The original question is just simply, how do we interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament? You've got to, first of all, interpret the Old Testament rightly. Okay? And by the way, the early Christians, the Old Testament was their scriptures. They used the Old Testament. The prophet, or excuse me, the apostles quoted from the Old Testament. And so, it's not as if we could say, oh, well, we just got the New Testament, that we don't need the Old Testament. Yeah, we do. But we have to interpret the Old Testament correctly. And that's why I wanted to talk about what the Old Testament was about, what the law was about, how the law has been fulfilled by the person of Christ. Because once we start to view it that way, then we can start to see how the Old Testament and the New Testament is kind of like this big clamshell that just kind of comes together and fits very nicely together. All right? And so do we need the Old Testament to explain the New Testament? Yep, we do. But do we need the New Testament kind of better understand what the Old Testament is about? Yes, we do. The two go hand in hand together, and you can interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, but you can also interpret the New Testament in light of the Old Testament as well. Okay? But to do that, you've got to get a proper understanding about what the Old Testament was about. And what the Old Testament was about is just exactly what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. And that is, it was there for him to fulfill it. And so he fulfilled all the requirements of the law, but in addition to that, Jesus also fulfilled all the prophecies about him as well. Okay? All right. Do you have any comments and questions about that one?